I see lots of familiar faces. My name is Evelyn Rodriguez, and I'm currently the Director of the Office of Education for USAID, and absolutely thrilled to see those of you that are in the audience today, many faces that are familiar, and very happy to know that there are a number of you listening out there. So thank you for taking the time to spend a little bit of your day, your Friday, with us. This is a critical element of the work that AID is moving forward with, and I know there are going to be a lot of questions out there as to where we are in this process and why you're here and why we're having this discussion, but that will be answered by our technical experts here. I have an amazing team. The fact that we are where we are today with this costing work is because we have the right people on the team that can move it forward, but we also have a broader team that then is taking that information and can kind of vet it from the reality of their own technical areas. And then we have you folks. I've been in the world of development now for 20-plus years. 16 of those have been with AID. If I learned anything early on, it's that as an education officer, I mean absolutely very little to the process. The work is done by you folks. You are the reason that development moves forward in our sphere. You are on the ground. You are making things happen, and we're hoping that that's the role you're going to play with this. You may have a lot of reservations because anytime anything new is introduced, we're always like, what's the first thing when my boss says so-and-so wants you to do, and can you imagine we have a new administration coming in, so every time anybody says, by the way, I'm like, what do you want us to do now? And I don't have the bandwidth, and how are we going to get this done? But I usually try to move very quickly to why is it important, how can we do it more effectively, how can we do it more efficiently? And that's what we're hoping the conversation will be about today. USAID and across the government, we're looking at more and more having to justify the funding that we're receiving and what we're doing with it. So it's really costing out our programs and what we're doing and how we're doing it, and making sure that what we're spending and the quality of the work we're doing go hand in hand, being able to identify the nuances of where the cost is. Really, 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 they're not important. They're paramount to our being able to justify our funding. So this is a really important time. They're going to talk, my team will talk a little bit more about this whole pilot phase. It is really all about perfecting this, making this not only an instrument that will help us get the information we need, but an instrument that will help you do your jobs better. It's all about all of us moving up the level of quality of the work that we're doing. So I don't want to spend a lot of time more than just to say it's important. I'm so glad we have the depth of expertise to do it, and by that I don't mean the people on the sidelines that work in my office, but also all of you that are involved, that we're going to be involved in helping us do this work better. And please, we are always open to dialogue. If you have questions, concerns as we move forward with this, don't hesitate to call on us, because we need your participation at all levels. So happy to be here, always happy to see all of you, and I'm going to turn this over to Nina Papadopoulos.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to everybody online. It's great to see so many people on a Friday and to hear so many people on a Friday. I'm Nina Papadopoulos. I work in the education office at USAID, and I represent the Education and Crisis and Conflict team, but I also am the COR for the ABE Access IDIQ. And you're invited here today because you are associated with the IDIQ, and also our colleague Marcia Davidson is here, and she's the acting team lead for the reading team, and she's here for the representation of the ABE Learn IDIQ. So we wanted to give you a little sense of how we want to run this meeting today. The objectives for this period are to describe the purpose of the guidance and how it was developed, present the cost reporting approach, and outline the process of engaging implementing partners in piloting the guidance. So we hope to be able to cover that in the period of time that we have together. And here's our brief agenda, and we want to make sure that we leave at least 30 minutes at the end of the presentation for our Q&A period. And I want to tell you a little bit about how we want to manage the Q&A in order to be the most efficient and time-saving. So we had actually written to you the questions that we're interested in hearing from you on prior to this meeting, but I want to repeat them for those of you who may not have had a chance to look at them. The first question is, does the guidance provide sufficient information on how to report on project expenditure and contributions of other parties? The second question is, are there any additional templates or examples that could be helpful to us in this process? The third question is, to what degree do you feel cost reporting categories that are identified in the guidance align with the scope of work of the education projects you implement? And then, of course, we're also interested in any other experiences that you can share with us in terms of how your agency or organization has done cost reporting. So we'd like to hear about that. And again, in order to be most efficient, we want you to write your questions down on the note cards, and during the presentation, feel free to pass those cards to the end of the rows. And our colleagues Katie and Lauren will be available to collect those questions. As we collect your questions, we're going to collate them and try to group them. And so that by the end of the presentation, we'll have some categories of questions that we can then present to the experts that are here to help us answer them. Some of your questions, either A, we might not have an answer to, or B, we don't have time to answer them. All of our questions that are asked today, we're committed to posting them on the ECCN website within 5 days of the meeting, and we will do our best to answer the ones we can answer and to get back to the ones that we can't. So we just really want to show our commitment to working together and working with you to get as many of these questions answered, but also to get feedback because we're really interested in that as well. And I want to encourage the folks on WebEx to send your questions in through the chat function, and we'll be collecting those as well. I'd like to now hand it over to my colleague, Christine Beggs.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your time again on this Friday, and those of you who are joining us online. I'm Christine Beggs, as Nina said, and I lead our evidence team, who has been working with our colleagues within USAID to move this work forward. I'm just so excited to be here, both in this dialogue and starting this kind of more intensive dialogue about this work over the next period of time, but also just to kind of bring us together on the kind of the rationale and the background and, in effect, our vision for this work and what we're trying to accomplish. You know, as Evelyn pointed to, this work is so critical for our sector, and, you know, as we've seen kind of an increase in our investment collectively to evidence building and more rigorous evaluation, you know, and bringing forward better evidence about and improvements in efficiency and impact within the education sector, this work really goes hand in hand with that, because I think those of us who have kind of looked at the impact of our programs recognize that when we look at those studies, it's really only half of the picture or less than half the picture if we're not able to say something about what the cost of those interventions were. And so I think it's really kind of this next level of us elevating our practice in this sector together. And, you know, as well, I think this work serves at a number of different levels. Oh, sorry, let me advance the slide here for folks. This work serves at a number of different levels. One, we know that we need to have better delineated cost data to do kind of almost the most basic cost analyses that we're not able to do both within our organizations and kind of across for USAID across our portfolio. And so to support those most basic cost analyses, but again, to complement the increased investment we've had in impact evaluations and rigorous studies and marry those so that we can do some more complex cost-effectiveness analyses. You know, we know from our discussions with folks like Patrick McEwen and others who have been leading really wonderful, you know, systematic reviews or meta-analyses where they're trying to implement some of these cost-effectiveness analyses. They just don't have the data. You know, whether it's somebody, you know, I had a recent conversation with the ILO looking at youth programming, and they did their best to do a cost-effectiveness analysis, and they just didn't have, you know, the data within the organization to do that. And those folks like JPAL and 3IE and the bank and others who are trying to look across, organizations and projects, we do not have the cost data structure to be able to do this work. I think in addition to that, this work is critical for scale and sustainability. We know collectively, like, that's our commitment. That's our long-term goal. We want to be able to have evidence of effective models and effective programs, and then we want to be able to, transition that work to our host country partners, integrate those into the, the national systems, and scale those up for sustained outcomes and sustained capacity. And again, part of that picture is talking to our host country governments about what the cost or what, in effect, what the ingredients are, what the inputs are that are required to deliver these projects and get the kind of impact, when we do see positive impact. And we really need to have kind of this data for those country dialogues. I think another really important level to talk about is at the global level. I mean, we have an unprecedented opportunity right now with the attention that's been placed on international education development, with the Education Financing Commission, a number of new donors, including, Norway and others, who are really investing a lot and leading the way. So our visibility within the international, fora is incredibly high for this sector. And, a big part of that conversation, and I know the Financing Commission is focusing on this, is what is the funding gap at the international global level to reach the Millennium Development Goals or other host country goals. And, there have been a number of analyses on that kind of put out some large figures on where the financing gap is on an annual basis. But when you unpack those models and what kind of the inputs that are using for those analyses, it needs to be stronger. And people like Justin Sandefur have done some modeling on this and looked at that and said, we really don't have the kind of data we need. So, we're really working at all of these. We see this initiative of being able to advance all of these different levels. And so I want to talk a little bit now about the process of development. I mean, this is work that in its very most nascent form started back in 2012 under some work that was done by RTI under an Data 2 task order, looking at breaking down a kind of cost and understanding the cost structure for early grade reading programs. And I mention that because that's kind of where some of this work and thinking started, but we've since our approach really now has kind of fundamentally shifted to look at a strategy-wide approach for costs, because what we recognize is that our missions have obviously a broad portfolio across all the goals of our education strategy, and we also have a lot of activities that are now blended. We don't have necessarily a clean delineation between, the different goals of our strategy. And this kind of work lends itself towards having a standardized approach across all of our goals regardless. Now, what we do recognize is that the analyses and kind of the analytical framework and what we do with the data could very well be different across our goals in different contexts. But in terms of having kind of a foundational approach, it will be common across our strategy. And that kind of goes with our, our approach of looking at our entire portfolio and across our strategy. I think the other thing I wanted to say was that, this has been, and Elena will talk about this more in detail of what's to come in the next 9 months or so in terms of this pilot period, but there's already been a highly consultative process. We have had a number of meetings with the Beck M&E group, who's kind of my team's, in effect, one of our really important relationships as we talk about reporting requirements and things like that. So we've had a number of consultations there. We have looked at kind of some of the early experiences that our missions and a couple of the partners that already have this language in their awards and are trying to, comply with this language and figure out the best approach that works for their country teams. We have also had a number of consultations with experts. So people like Patrick McEwen, those at the World Bank, with JPAL, with SIF, another donor who's doing a lot of really innovative work on cost. So part of what I wanted to emphasize today is that we are engaging with other donors directly and then also through a donor working group on building evidence and education to harmonize this work so that as a sector, again, we're able to kind of meet those sector-wide objectives in what we're doing with cost. So, and we actually we're having a workshop at CIS that's sponsored by that donor working group on cost, and it's going to engage with some of the bank work Bank's work on this and USAID's work as well, and with DFID, who's an important partner in our harmonizing on this. So I just, we've also spent some time talking with our missions and have done a mission survey and understanding what kind of demand they see, both for their own, to manage their own portfolio, but also with their host country government dialogues. And, the demand is incredibly high, and I think it'll really kind of complement those learning and accountability feedback loops at the country level. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to kind of give some of that background, and Elena, again, will talk more about the piloting process. But I really just, again, wanted to emphasize what Nina spoke so eloquently about, is that we recognize that, we've put a lot of thought in this. We've tried to be as consultative and kind of thoughtful in this pilot version, but we recognize when you're trying to institutionalize something like this across multiple organizations that we're going to have to make adjustments, and we are committed to being very thoughtful, very open about that, and, we just want to kind of get this right as a sector together. So I'll turn it over to Elena Venegordova now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much, Evelyn, Nina, and Christine, for laying out so eloquently why we're doing this work, why we're here today. My job for the next 30 minutes is going to be to walk you through the guidance and to explain more of the how we are proposing to do that before we launch into the question period. So in a nutshell, we know that organizations are already reporting, submitting financial reports quarterly to USAID. We know that we have information from invoicing that actually talks about what we call ingredients, such as, specifically what resources are being spent on. So why do we need this new approach? So what the purpose of the guidance, what is it trying to do, is to standardize and establish a common structure of how the implementing community is capturing costs and capturing expenditure across our entire portfolio. So basically, this is objective number one, is to structure, once again, how we capture and report on expenditure. Objective number two here is actually quite a departure from what we've traditionally been doing, because we really need to also document and report what are the third-party contributions to our activities. And this is something that, differently from the first point here, has really not been done in any systematic way. And we feel that this is really important and a big omission so far, that it's not really been consistently documented and reported. So we really, on one hand, we know host country governments, private companies, individuals all contribute to our work, but we don't know where, how much, to what extent, how it correlates with results. We can't really do any kind of a thoughtful analysis about that. And third, what also we identified through a careful review of reports on the deck is that we understand that while through the PPR system we do capture information on outputs of our projects and some outcomes, what we don't know is details of those interventions, and we don't know details of the dosage at the final beneficiary level. Let me give you a quick example. One of the most commonly used standard indicators would be numbers of teachers trained. Now, how is training defined? Is 16 hours or more, right? We all know that. So whether or not it's been 16 hours or it could be 3 months, there's really, in the PPR, there's no way of knowing, right? It's still number one person. So, and we don't know how many students that teacher might be teaching, So we're lacking some very important information that clearly we all know it makes difference, understanding those details, but right now we have no ways of capturing that. So what we try, basically what the guidance is trying to do is to address those three main elements. So the guidance, we put here the slide just for a very brief kind of a summary of the key principles that are outlined in the guidance. Well, first of all, we do want to collect information on all expenditure. So it's not just something that relates to very specific component, but basically if activity is implemented within education portfolio, we would like to have that activity report on the entirety of its expenditure. Also, details of expenditure must be reported, and this is what in some contracts or awards was previously mentioned as ingredients, in the ingredients method. sort of to clarify it, to make it kind of a more commonly understood, I call it here details of expenditure, meaning how much money we spend on salaries, how much money we spend on transportation, what is security costs, things like that. As I already mentioned, it's really important for us to collect information on activity-critical contributions from third parties, and that includes host country governments, private companies, individuals. So basically, anybody who contributes in a way that is really essential for the project, we would like to know about that, and we provide templates for reporting. Now, I must mention that the guidance does come with extensive annexes that have a lot of details and examples and information, and we hope that throughout the next few months, as we work with all of you to improve the guidance, you will help us enrich that list and include additional examples that would hopefully be helpful for others as well. It's also important that the final kind of decisions about what categories to include in the reporting system and subcategories as well is informed by the evaluation of research agenda. As Christine mentioned, one of our core objectives is to be able to conduct cost-effectiveness analysis and really thoughtful cost analysis. And we can only do that if we structure the capture of our expenditure appropriately. So for instance, if the project is implementing 2 different types of intervention with the same beneficiary group, to try to understand which one produces better results, it makes sense not just to keep track of the outcomes that result of from those 2 different types of interventions, but also the cost, because the cost might be different. And let me give you an example. For instance, if a project, early grade reading project, would like to know to what extent coaching adds value to the final results, it makes sense to keep track of the part of the intervention that's implemented without coaching and the part of the intervention that's implemented with coaching component, and not just to keep track of the final outcome in terms of student learning, but also how much does it actually cost, what is the cost difference. The categories for cost reporting are standards that we're proposing, and they cannot be renamed or collapsed in any way. However, we do encourage implementers to think about what is meaningful to add in terms of subcategories, because some of those categories are, by definition, intentionally pretty large. So say, again, for instance, in the example I just gave about coaching, if which is a really an important component for the project, that you might want to purposefully select the subcodes that would reflect those 2 types of intervention. So the one thing that we do want to, for all implementers to do is to include a development subcategory where, in those cases where development is an important component. And the guidance provides certain kind of rules of thumb how to decide if it's large enough to include or not. Because, of course, if we understand that every project has some development component, so we only ask you to add that as a subcategory if it is indeed a substantial part of your work and not just the first few weeks or like during the startup. So out of all categories that are listed in the guidance, all projects really must include only 2, which is general management and operations and M&E, understanding that no project can be implemented without those 2 components. So we would like to make sure that folks remember that. And finally, the one thing that we do want to emphasize, this is quite different from the traditional, although it does build on the practices that are already in place, but it is a departure in some ways as well, because we understand that differently perhaps from a traditional way of financial reporting, we actually do want folks to capture things how they occur in real time, so to speak. So we understand that our desire to have more information, of course, might, be more sometimes burdensome that you guys might be comfortable with. So final decisions really about how many subcategories to select really must address that balance, in terms of using too many codes and having too much burden on your staff trying to remember where to bill their time, or for your accounting department, which code to use with any particular purchase, as opposed to, having just a few large categories, but then you won't be able to, really tease out some important elements. So in a nutshell, this is the structure of the categories. So all of the project expenditure can be seen as falling into those two big categories, operations and M&E versus technical expenditure. And under technical, we have identified 8 core categories that really emerged from a review of a large number of education projects. So this is basically what most projects do. They train teachers, they produce materials, they develop capacity, work with communities. And so within all of those categories, we ask that implementers report on a standard reporting categories to USAID like they've been reporting before. Once again, we are trying to build on practices that are already in place, such as the quarterly financial reporting, your invoicing to USAID, but basically the practices that have been well established. All we're saying here is that please remember to use those categories like you would use CLINS. So let me give you some examples. I picked 2 categories to walk you through just as I thought that would be perhaps the most, resonate with you the most. The first category is general management and operations. So the guidance provides the definition of each category, examples what to include in each category, and what to code elsewhere. So for instance, if we look at the general management and operations category, the definition here is that this category of cost reporting includes labor and other expenditure relating to coordination of human and material resources to achieve overall objective goals, shared program costs such as cost of rent of in-country facilities, utilities, communication services, legal fees, software licenses, liability insurance, vehicle pool, security costs, and other expenditure relating to the general management and operations. It also includes the cost of starting the project up and closing the project down. Examples what to include in this category, just for you sort of to make it real. For instance, staff time devoted to overall management of the project, such as chief of party, project director, project coordinator, financial analyst, human resources manager, logistics manager, communication manager, and deputy chief of party for operations. As I already listed in the definition, all the shared program costs also should be coded within this category, as well as all short-term technical assistance relating to general management and operations. So what's important here, I guess, is to remember is that if the cost or if this resource has been expended to support the entirety of the project, that's where it belongs, really, is general management and operations. So what to code elsewhere? The guidance also provides some of those examples just to make it clear, how we're trying to delineate that. So in this category, what to code elsewhere would be labor and other costs relating to management of specific components and deliverables. So for instance, if one of your project's components relates to, say, Safe Schools, and you have a manager for Safe Schools, so that manager bills his or her time to the Safe Schools category, not the general management. General management, once again, by definition, is about the overall project, not a specific component of the project. The other example I wanted to give you is on teacher training. So teacher training category is defined as category of expenditure reporting that includes all labor, materials, and other resources expended for training teaching force, including facilitators, instructors, principals, coaches, mentors, tertiary level instructors or professors, with the objective of improving knowledge and practice of instruction. Training here is understood as a transfer of knowledge in content area of instruction, assessments, pedagogical practices, capacity to provide healing and supportive environment for students, language competency, use of instructional technology, among other areas. So what's essential here is just, again, for you sort of to help you think about that. What is the objective of the training? If the objective is to improve the instructional process and instructional practice, so that's where this resource would belong. So conversely, to give you an example, if we're training teachers but in something completely different, for instance, on the new whatever billing system, right, something that does not relate to instruction, then it would belong in another category. It would belong in capacity building category. But those are very rare, those cases, so I think majority of cases that you guys would encounter in terms of teacher training would fall in this category. So what to include. And as Christine emphasized, this reporting guidance is intentionally very cross-goal, and it's really designed to be applicable to a variety of projects implemented in education. So you will see here examples from early grade, from crisis and conflict projects, as well as workforce development and higher education. I'm not going to read the list. Basically, some of the examples to give you here is that it's not just the training per se that belongs in this category, but also such things as formative assessment of practices designed to develop the training, development of production materials for training purpose. So basically things that enable for training to occur, okay? All right, so what to code elsewhere. So just because it's training doesn't mean it needs to go into teacher training. For instance, parent training should be reported under parental community engagement category. Training of government officials to support a policy development, for instance, should go under policy capacity development. For instance, if your analyst flies to the country to work with the government officials to help use agri-data, where does it go? That would go not under teacher training, that would go under policy and capacity development category. All of these examples are included in the guidance, but once again, I just would like to encourage all of you to think of like difficult or problematic or unclear cases that, you know, you think, oh my God, I'm not really sure where I should put it, and share with us, share with the community. ECCN kindly offered to use their website as a forum, so we hope that we will be able to engage in a conversation to really help us all figure out how to do this better. Some other couple of examples I wanted to give also. Payments to organizations to support teaching incentives for direct service delivery should be reported on the block grants category, sort of that is specifically dedicated to capture such expenditure. And as I already mentioned, training teachers, for instance, in something else other than instruction should go under policy and capacity development. So a couple of organizations very kindly shared their attempts to use the guidance to structure their system, their code system for a project. So just to give you this as an example, how the existing categories from the guidance could be used to help organize project accounting systems. So this is one example. As you can see, we highlighted in bold the standard categories, and unbolded are the subcategories. The second example is this one. So the first example was from Courtesy of Creative from Afghanistan. This example is Courtesy of RTI from Nepal. And as you can see, they break down the material development into a variety of different codes because that came as a request from the local government, and they had it as separate CLINs already. So, but nonetheless, we were able to align it with the categories within, with the guidance, and in the end, it actually works just fine. So bottom line here, what the final product, the final list of your categories may differ because you might need to include some of the, again, categories from CLINs or others. So as long as we can have those, our big categories from the guidance kind of pulled out from here, we're okay with that. So real quick to talk about inputs from other sources. This is something that's new. I know we haven't really done this before in any kind of standardized way. Some organizations already report on cost share, for instance. So this is probably the closest institutional practice that you're familiar with. But nonetheless, it does have certain departures. So while different organizations report differently on cost share, we provide standardized template how we would like organizations to report on contributions from host government as well as private actors. So what's important here to remember is we do not ask you to monetize any of that. And this is really the hard part, is really assigning the dollar value. The reason why we're not asking you to do that, first of all, is because we really don't want to increase the burden on you, and we understand it's burdensome. And second, because we want to standardize the error, so to speak. So we will be doing it ourselves, making sure then, you know, because we'll be using the same approach. So whatever imprecision will result from that approach, at least will be identical across all projects. So for us, it will be an advantage in that sense. In terms of other donor activities, we understand that you would not necessarily have details about that, so all we're asking in the template is to provide a description of such activities that you know are occurring in the area where you work and may in some ways affect the results of your project. So all we're asking is to report who's the donor, you know, what the project is called, and a brief description. And if we need to, we will look it up ourselves through our donor group. So we understand that, as Evelyn said in her opening remarks, that this is a change, this is something new. And of course, as always, change comes always with a little bit of pain. So we know that there will be challenges, and some challenges perhaps are more evident and obvious than others. So, but we are aware of that, and we're already taking steps to address them or develop supporting documentation that would help address those. So, for instance, we understand that there could be confusion, there could be a period of adaptation to learning how to use the new guidance. So we will be engaging intensely with both you and with our missions to help get everybody on the same page, make sure that we all understand guidance the same way and there's no, miscommunication or no misunderstandings. We also understand that in terms of data submission, we need to have a secure and reliable data transfer mechanism, so we also will be working on that. Data use is, of course, probably on your mind already, like what are we going to do with the data? How are we going to process that? Who's going to know the results? We are working to establish very clear parameters for how the data will be used, as well as standardize how data will be analyzed. Because, for instance, right now, if we look at cost-effectiveness analysis conducted by our evaluation partners, they use different methodology. Therefore, the number, the numbers might not be comparable, and for us it's an issue, so we will be working to address those. And finally, it's our commitment to try to reduce the burden of this new guidance as much as possible, so we will look to you to hear what additional templates might help, what additional support might be needed, the additional documentation. So the more you guys engage with us, the more you can ask us, your specific concern, your specific questions, the more helpful we can be to you in this process. So in terms of the next steps, as Christine mentioned, so we're launching the 9-10 months pilot period with this meeting. So what does it mean? It means that we are going to work very intensely with you and with missions to help improve, first of all, to document everybody's experiences, to understand what kind of additional documentation is needed and develop that documentation, to develop as I said, analysis and data use parameters. And we also want to help facilitate your engagement with the missions around the cost reporting issues. So after the end of this pilot period, we will also conduct some case studies as well to help us better understand the process and your experiences. And at the end of this process, we will conduct revisions of the guidance and move on to the next steps. So the objectives of the pilot that we're launching is, first of all, to understand the effect of the guidance on activity management, adaptation, and learning at the country level. We understand that that's where rubber will hit the road, really, to what extent this difference in reporting requirements will affect your relationships with the mission and how you're reporting and how the projects are being managed. We hope the effect will be for the better, but we will definitely, we look forward to working with you to really help us better understand that. We also want to assess the quality and utility of course data that's reported. So again, we appreciate the fact that this is a change, so we anticipate there will be some bumps in the road and there will be some difficulties, but we do want to understand what we can do to improve the quality of the data and make sure it's reliable and useful. And of course, as I already mentioned, understand your experiences and your needs for additional guidance, templates, examples, information support. So we could be responsive to that as well. The specifics of the pilot in the next few months are as follows. We will be seeking your input continuously. We will be running quarterly surveys to get your feedback on the use of the guidance. We will also be reviewing the reports you'll be submitting And at the end of the pilot, well, closer to the end, we will conduct 2 to 3 in-depth case studies to understand how the guidance is being used by large implementers, medium implementers, country partners in different contexts. So we hope that will be very helpful. We will be providing you continuous support throughout quarterly webinars with live Q&A and TA upon request. And we will also be preparing continuous kind of information sharing vehicles such as quarterly newsletters with updates, frequently asked questions, results of quarterly surveys, and the like. So that basically concludes my presentation of the reporting guidance, and now I would like to turn to Q&A.
Thanks, Elena. Thank you so much. That was great. Every time I hear Elena talk about this, I learn something new. I think we're really lucky to have her on board. Thank you. I'm just curious, Amy, I have a question for you. How many questions did we get in from the webcast? I'm just curious. Okay. Yeah, webcast folks, please give us a chat and let us know if you have any questions or if you have anything to add. Okay, so I'm going to start. Nina Weisenhorn in the back has been collating some of your questions and remarks and putting them into categories. So the first question that we have. Sure. 3-minute pause. Do folks want to maybe take a restroom break real quick for a few minutes? Okay. Yeah, why don't I read them and then I'll hand it over to you. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. So we have a question from the group here. What is USAID's thoughts on comparability of the data that will be reported?
So we recognize that implementing a project in a very stable upper middle income country is very different comparing to implementing a project in, say, crisis and conflict setting with low, like really poor institutional background. We completely understand that. And this is actually a part of rationale why we need to have this new approach, is because at this point we really don't know very well to what extent the structure of cost differs when we implement projects in different contexts. So the intent with the data analysis is not to lump all the projects together and say, well, this project is so much more expensive because it's in South Sudan, but rather to really help us better understand how the structure of expenditure differs across different contexts, and also what sort of inputs are needed to produce results in different contexts.
Thanks, Elena. So, I mean, they're going to have to come up and speak up here because of the WebEx.
I can repeat.
Direct expenditures to third-party contributions where there's so many assumptions and estimations.
So the follow-up question to this is the difference between the project expenditures opposed to contributions. So once again, at this point, we do not have any data, any solid, comparable, reliable data on what kind of contributions our projects enjoy. We have, in general, an idea that host countries typically are committed to contributing some goodwill or materials or labor or something. We also have an idea that when it is a cost share requirement, we have that, but we don't have data to make any kind of analyses or link these contributions to the long-term results of the project. So once again, once we start getting this data, we will be able to make some informed conclusions of sorts about what sort of contributions we need to expect in order to have solid results. Let me give you an example. If the project has been implemented, for instance, in a middle-income country, and the project, for instance, involves the government systems, such as education systems, we would expect to see a pretty significant involvement from the government in order to ensure sustainability of results. So again, at this point, kind of naturally, it makes sense as a hypothesis, but again, we have no data to confirm or, disconfirm this hypothesis. We would like to really amass the data before we make any kind of conclusions. And again, the intent is not to compare and discriminate against those that we understand are disadvantaged from the beginning because of institutional context.
Thanks, Elena. And the next question is, The next question is, what is the rationale for quarterly cost reporting? Could this vary from one project to another?
Thank you. This is a great question. I love it because it really allows me to emphasize the intent here is to build on existing practices. All of the projects submit quarterly reports, financial reports to USAID, and the intent of this guidance is basically to reshape those quarterly reports somewhat. So it's not like it's something new. If you imagine your quarterly report by CLINS, it's the same thing. It's just quarterly report by categories. Yes? The question in the audience is about application of quarterly reporting for third-party contribution. To answer this question, we will be looking at it in depth during the pilot period. For us, what's essential during this pilot period of the next 9 to 11 months is to really map out where the pain points are, to understand what additional guidance might be needed. And in terms of reporting on third-party contributions, for instance, the guidance and templates are pretty clear. We ask for estimates. We don't ask for any verification. We ask for, according to the template anyway, just to submit as a brief description of what the project director or COP is aware that's being done. So, next question? Okay.
Okay, sorry. So one of the next questions is, are subcategories required, or can we simply report all costs by categories only?
We only require development and implementation subcategories in those instances where those are substantial, and the substantial is defined in the guidance.
Okay, and I'll go ahead and take this one. The question is, why would partners capture donor contributions? This should be a donor-to-donor activity. So what's intended here is just for, in your intervention area, if, for instance, you have some coordination, and there's coordination at country level where, let's say you're doing a reading program and you have another donor, or the GPE through the bank or something is delivering materials to your intervention schools, as an example, and you've got that kind of coordination and harmonization. It's that kind of information that we want to know about. That's very directed intervention by another donor that is intended to kind of complement and supplement, and in effect is part of your intervention, or becomes part of the treatment for that intervention area. I think as well, there's a question here I want to address, which is case-by-case project selection for case studies, which projects and timeline for notification. So I'll answer this I have two interpretations possibly of this. So one is the case studies that we're looking at doing at the end of the pilot period. And I think what we'd want to do is use the information that we're going to get back with the kind of ongoing dialogue to inform the selection of those case studies. We may pick one that's kind of a positive deviance approach, for something that's like working really well, good alignment, and we seem to be getting Another piece that's going to be part of the end of the pilot is doing some data quality assessment. So we'll probably use kind of the information that we accrue over the next 9 months to catch those, and we might decide to do one that seems where, the categories are ill-aligned, or it seems to be, kind of struggling with implementing the guidance, and one that's positive, but we'll have to see as we get there. I think another way I want to answer this question, I wasn't sure how it was intended, is as part of our analytical framework, we obviously want to be able to execute some cost-effectiveness analyses on those programs where, that are highly relevant, aligned to our strategy, show some promise based on the results of, fairly rigorous impact evaluations, and then couple that with the cost data. So there will be a process that's part of the analytical framework for this data that comes once we kind of complete the first round of data submissions. I wanted to address those too.
So the question is, the current cost categories do not have a category for direct training or service to youth or children. Where does something like training youth in leadership skills or work readiness skills fit? So the training would fit, okay, really depends. So we need to look more closely. For example, the guidance emphasizes if you are transferring money to an organization to conduct training directly, that would go under the block grants. If you are training facilitators how to do that, say, soft skills or work readiness skills, that's probably the most common scenario, and that's going to go under teacher training, right? Because if you're training facilitators, it's improve the instruction, so that's where it belongs. So, and again, the reason why it's a little tricky, because we like to think that we kind of skip that middle step frequently, right? We think, well, we work with youth. Well, effectively, we actually rarely work directly with youth. We frequently work with youth is mediated by working with TVETs, with, again, maybe non-formal centers, other organizations. So in which cases, you kind of need to look at what your activities actually are, right? So if your activity involves training facilitators, shoring up the capacity of TVETs, that belongs in their own respective categories. If you are providing grants for direct teacher incentives or direct payments to facilitators because it's in Afghanistan, for example, or in some other disrupted context, that's going to go into block grants because it's a direct payment to an organization. Okay.
That's been the number one.
Right. So there's this very important question that we actually don't have clear answer ourselves yet because we will be developing the answer to this question, looking at the variety of experiences. The question is, do you expect budgets to be realigned to cost ingredients categories? Will proposals also require such alignment? So we have discussed this at length with implementers as well as missions and internally, and we understand there could be pros and cons to both solutions. So we totally realize that. And I think this is one of those important internal questions that we have for ourselves for the pilot period, is just to see what naturally seems to be working better and whether or not we even need to have that kind of determination. Because we may not. Maybe it will be, decided by missions and for each individual case. All we're asking in the guidance is how to report on expenditure, right? And to what extent you can realign that post factum, or you want to realign it initially at the proposal stage. Again, I think it will be ultimately up to the missions.
So one of the questions here is, how should costs from other USG contributions be reported? So for instance, if you've got a co-located project with Feed the Future or maybe McGovern-Dole or something like that, we would anticipate you would want to do the same as we suggested with the donor, tracking other donor contributions, just to know that you've got co-located projects and the kinds of inputs that they're providing into your intervention area. I have another one here, and I'm going to turn this over to Elena, but I'll go ahead and read the question. When it comes to making final decisions on categories and specific items to include in each for a specific project, who has the final decision-making or authority? What is the process and timing for finalizing the specific cost categories for each project? It's going to be a mission-based.
I have to say, I just love questions. I can just point to the page in the guidance. So this one of those. There is actually a very clear description of the process in the guidance that you can find. I actually don't remember the page off the top of my head. Okay. Anyway, so the process that we suggested in the it's on section 4.2 on page 7. Basically, you begin by matching what your project is supposed to be doing, the scope, with the categories, and it is supposed to be a consultative process with the mission. So the mission and the implementer are supposed to work together on this to really help identify how best to, which categories are really fitting best the scope of work of the project. And once again, a very important consideration whether or not the project has been identified for external evaluation or even has a strong internal evaluation component. Because if that's the case, that will inform the final selection of categories and stuff. Not categories, but more like subcategories. Because again, for instance, if you are implementing, say, a project that I have seen actually that is designed to, during the first 2 years, to test different models of youth workforce development in comparable regions, you know, clearly you need to make sure that you track that, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to use the cost piece to inform your understanding of results versus cost, right? Because in terms of like cost effectiveness, if you remember cost over effect, we look at the expenditure and we compare that expenditure to results, right? We need to be able to capture both. So it's insufficient just to simply look at, well, we implemented these 3 different components and component 1 seems to produce the best results. Yes, that might be, but maybe it's twice as expensive as component 2, which was just fell short just a little bit, right? So cost really does play a very significant role in those decisions. So the follow-up question is what they, who in the mission, so the question is who in the mission you're supposed to be working with? Well, my immediate response would be your AOR or COR would be your point of contact. Now that person, or your CO, right. 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 So what I would suggest you think about it as vast majority of you I would anticipate have had experience with CLINs, right, contract line item numbers, right? So this is kind of a similar thing, but CLINs typically are designed at the mission level by their OA, while what we're trying to do is standardize it across all missions. So effectively, whatever you would do when you work with your CLINs, that's the same process, but it's just here we're using the standardized categories from the guidance.
And I think just to add to that, to speak to an example that Elena had up earlier with Nepal, for example, and some other missions we're working with their partners on technical assistance on this, it really is driven by the business interest, if you will, of the mission. And so the Nepal technical team, the education office, had a lot of influence on how they wanted to see these costs disaggregated so that they could have the kind of policy discussions. We also have an external impact evaluation on that project, so we want to make sure it aligns with the kind of analysis we want to do on the evaluation. And so there's a real kind of like a technical business discussion there, as well as with the CO, obviously. So, but that's a good question, and I think too it's a flag for us to make sure that as we have this guidance and we're also having a supplemental package to the missions, kind of a USAID-oriented guidance, that process is something that we need to kind of dive into and really tease out and articulate for everyone. So thank you for that. That's really important. Yeah, please.
Just real quick to add as well, another good example, like Christine was just saying about Nepal. We hear frequently questions such as, well, how much do those materials cost? How much does this cost? The reality is, if you just, for instance, if you're operating in, say, Ghana, where you have materials in English, or materials in a language that maybe even does not have orthography really well defined yet, right? They all get reported under the same standard indicator, teacher and learning materials, right? But we would all agree that producing those reading materials on those two languages would have vastly different costs, right? So this would be like one of the examples to consider when you think about what do I want to track. So if you as an implementer really want to make a case to your mission and to the world that, you know what, producing materials in that language is like 10 times as expensive as producing materials in English, and mission needs to be aware of that. You know, this is something you might consider pulling out as a subcategory because it will be beneficial to you, to the mission, and to the field in general.
And sorry, can I add on to that? I mean, one of the two primary subcategories we have beyond those 8 core categories of typical kind of activities, a really important distinction here is around development and implementation. So it's kind of, in other words, you know, kind of your non-recurring costs and your recurring costs. And to just extend on this example, one of the things we also don't want to see is lumping together this like large cost when you've got this development and bringing in writers' workshops and doing the work on the orthography and that whole process when you have, you know, new titles being developed for a language where titles don't exist. You also want to be able to show to delineate that one-time development cost, right, rather than kind of the recurring publishing and printing, so that as governments look at what it would cost for them to invest in scaling that up and continuing the printing and distribution of those titles, they're not looking at, you know, kind of one large big category that's not reflective of what it would cost going forward. So that's another, I think, really important delineation besides the different categories is this development versus implementation and how that's going to inform our thinking about the cost to scale things. Elena, I'd like you to take this next one if you don't mind, because I think it's an important point. Have you considered requiring IPs to include X months of a specialist to do the government cost analysis? And why don't you require governments to report on their own costs as part of the assistance agreement? I think part of the distinction is well, I think the important part of this is clarifying what government costs we're talking about. And I'm actually, you've got the more specific language on this, but just to clarify that it's just the incremental cost, right, for the project rather than, okay, sorry. Okay, so basically, you know, the government costs that we're referring to are incremental government costs without, and I shouldn't say costs, incremental government inputs and resources without which the project couldn't be delivered. So, for instance, if you're running, I keep coming up with early grade reading examples. I want another one. Let's say you've got, you know, a project that's education, conflict, and crisis, and you have engaged extra time by cluster supervisors or other entities within the education system to perform additional activities. Maybe it's community mobilization or doing some work on out-of-school sensitivity training or something like that. And if these activities are over and above what they would normally be doing in their work, and they are also critical to your intervention, then those need to be recorded. But what we're not referring to is like the salary of cluster supervisors or the salaries of teachers or something. But if you've got incremental, I'm trying to think of another example, but if you have incremental costs, so if, for instance, would you say like a government workshop that's over and above a typical to do, yeah, okay.
So the guidance annexes provide detailed description of what we here understand. What we're trying to say, think about it, we're not asking to cost out the existing education delivery system, right? We are not asking you to do that. What we're asking you to do is to report what are those inputs that the government provides that are essential to your project. So say if the government effectively donates the, say, 2 weeks of teachers' time during their vacation to attend your summer workshop or summer training institute, right? So this is clearly an opportunity cost for those teachers that needs to be recorded, right? Because those teachers could have been working during those 2 weeks when they're attending summer institute, right? So we need to have this information. However, what we don't need to, what we're not asking you, as Christine just said, is to give us salaries of those teachers. This is what we will be doing is capturing this information separately. I think Karen wants to have a...
Those were my questions. So maybe I didn't phrase it very well, but why don't you have agreements with the host situation. The second question was in recognition that this is going to take personnel, resources from the projects that are not programmed, why don't you just say, you know, in addition to your team, also need to 5 months of STTA, or 1 month of STTA.
I'll take the first, you take the second. Okay. So the first sub-question was, why don't we ask the government that question? Well, we feel that the project is positioned really well because you're working with the government and you know what they're actually providing. So say if you're working very closely, say, with their curriculum development team, you're co-located with curriculum development team, you're conducting weekly workshops or meetings with them, you're the ones who know about that. And all we're asking you is just simply to record that on a template and submit that. So we're not asking you to cost anything out. Those costs are, like say, if you're co-located, throughout the entire project, that will not change. You enter it once, and then you just continue with the same template. You don't need to re-enter it again, right? It's just kind of like a one-time expense. Usually, the reason why we are not convinced that it's such a huge burden is because a lot of those we're only asking you to report on critical contributions, substantial contributions, and those are frequently long-lasting. So say if the government hires 100 coaches to support your coaching program, you know, this is not something that will occur like differently every time. They will hire them once and they'll continue working with you. So again, you enter them in a template and you keep them there, you know, throughout the duration of the project from the moment when they start working, right? So I would just like to encourage you to think about it this way, that basically a lot of those contributions for you would be only to record them once, right? And once when that starts, and maybe second time, suppose after 2 years of implementation, the government decided, hey, it doesn't seem to be working very well for us. We're going to fire them all, you know? And then you basically just, in the next quarterly report, you just remove that line. That particular contribution has ceased to exist, right? So again, the templates provide extensive examples, and I would encourage you to get in touch with us if you have very specific examples that contradict our current understanding that it actually shouldn't be that burdensome. Christine, you want to take the second question?
You know, and yeah, just to reinforce what Elena has said, and just to kind of put it in reading the guidance, just to put it in the context of what exactly we're asking for, and that we're not asking, you know, to monetize those costs. It's about kind of inputs and resources, and those only that are over and above the ordinary education service delivery, and those that are critical to the implementation of your project, like a special coaching program or something. I think that, you know, one thing we didn't really touch on is, and we framed this around engagement with the IDIQ holders, but just to be aware that there are a number of contracts outside of the 2 IDIQs, the ABE Learn and ABE Access, ranging from both, you know, early grade reading and education conflict and crisis, but also our youth workforce development, that were full and open solicitations that have this requirement as well. And so what I guess I'd like to reinforce is that this is another reporting requirement, as you have other reporting requirements, whether it's on the standard indicators or others. And so, you know, as you develop to answer, Karen, your other part of your question, as you develop your, you know, your proposals and thinking about your team, to incorporate those things as you would, these are the resources I'm going to need to report as you do for all the other reporting requirements. But again, to reinforce, we've really tried to structure this in a manner that it's just about kind of a categorization and not an additional, you know, burden and load. And certainly these questions about the donor and the government contributions, I mean, we mentioned in the pilot, one of the objectives is going to be looking at the quality of the data that we've captured and also the utility. And so I'm sure this area is one we'll focus on, and whether or not we've struck the right balance in terms of, you know, the data we need and the precision and the comprehensiveness versus the work that it takes in the field. And this will be an area we'll look at very, very closely. So that's I think what we can offer for now. But if you want to do a follow-up, you know, and I do want to emphasize that we have the online kind of Q&A, that we want to keep more of a dialogue going on, and I think part of what we're going to try to accomplish, too, is we want everybody to see the discussion. So it's not just so much submit it to USAID and then we're going to, send out back answers. We want everybody to kind of see and be a part of the discussion, because we know the organizations represented here today, some of you are really engaged in this. You've already gone through your first cycle of cost reporting, and others, it's kind of something you're just now grappling with. It may be a requirement in some of your contracts, but you're just now kind of trying to sort out how to report on this. So, the experiences around this is something that you should contribute to that forum. So, do we have any other questions that we want to address? Okay. Oh, did you see this?
How are fees categorized? Which fees? Fees on contract.
I'll talk to you.
We'll get back to you on this. Yeah, I think it's just like however you normally address it. Again, just think the same way. Just yeah, yeah, yes. Yeah.
Matter of fact, I'm a little curious as to why it came up so late. The question is, will this be applied to other E3 projects or USAID in general? And so there's a reason for the pilot. We first need to see, one, if it works and how valuable the information is. And then as we move forward, it's a joint decision. We'll all take a look at whether or not this becomes a policy. I can guarantee that we will always say we highly recommend, because we already know the value. But for us to move forward with like a policy thing, it's actually beyond just the education team, because it's the agency speaking. So our contracting, our OAA office would play a big role in determining if in fact they felt comfortable mandating this of all of you. But for right now, and I know for sure it will always be a highly recommended, because we do know the value. Right? Sure. Yeah, there's already a number of awards with that language in it already, because here's a not surprising, missions are asking for this. They themselves have moved forward and put this language in. Elena gets emails, her box is clouded with people saying, we need this, the governments need it, it's a way to improve the work that we're doing. So the language is in there. We're not pushing this. As a matter of fact, we haven't had to. But we're waiting to see how to do it right, how to do it effectively and efficiently, and then we'll move forward. I saw hands.
We're dealing with situations where this language has been included in addition to CLIN, the CLINs don't match up with the cost ingredients, which is just...
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff we need to know, because we know it's going to come up. There's lots of things. The question was, there's a conflict between the language and the existing CLINs. And again, we know that that's the sort of thing that's going to come up. So do speak up. The forum that Christine mentioned, it's opened up for people to have those discussions online, if I understand, and direct communication with these folks. So we need to know. All right? So with that, Marcia's going to have some closing remarks. Again, I appreciate all of you coming today. Marcia?
Thank you, Evelyn. And before I thank everyone, I want to let you all know that some of the comments that have been posted online and that you have submitted are actually feedback rather than questions. So I want you to know that we will provide, there will be answers provided to those. I don't want you to think that some of the feedback was actually just ignored. We have everything, and I know it's going to be posted and responded to. I also, in thanking everyone, I first want to thank the audience audience, both virtually and those of you here today. Your participation, your input, your questions are really important to us. Our goal, of course, is to have the best impact on our projects and learning in terms of education, the learning of students as we possibly can. And our intent here by all of us in E3 is to improve the process of learning and building better programs for children and communities in all of the countries in which we work. And you're such a huge and critical part of this work. So we hope that this costing process will be a partnership with you, I think as Evelyn said at the beginning, and we all look forward to working with you and helping support you and addressing issues, particularly the issues of burden and cost, extra costs. Believe me, we're really aware, and I know Evidence is working hard, quite aware, and we will work closely with you to support you. I also certainly want to have a huge thank you to both Christine and Elena here for their hard work on this and the Evidence team in thinking about this and the importance of having really good, informative cost reporting that will allow us to make better decisions about what we're doing as our implementation. I want to thank Evelyn for opening and supporting all of this work as she always does for us. Thank you. And of course, we call the two Ninas, Nina W. and Nina P., who are with ECCN, who so graciously hosted this for us today on their website and set all of this up for us. And they're absolutely, sometimes tenaciously sort of gregarious and interested efforts to make sure that what we're doing is a marriage between our implementing partner colleagues and our work at USAID in education. So to everybody, thank you, and we look forward to working with you and learning more as this pilot continues. Thank you.